The dust of Millfield always settled thickest on those who had the least. In this prosperous cattle town of 1887, where silver dollars clinked in the pockets of ranchers and merchants, there walked a man whose very presence seemed to remind everyone of what failure looked like. Samuel Hayes moved through the streets like a shadow, his bare feet making soft impressions in the dirt roads that would be erased by the next passing wagon. His clothes, if they could still be called that, hung from his lean frame like pieces of weathered canvas. The shirt, once blue, had faded to the color of old bruises, and his trousers bore patches upon patches, creating a patchwork map of his struggles. "There goes Rags again," sneered Thomas Mitchell, the town's barber, as he swept hair from his shop's porch. "Wonder what sorry fool will pay him to fix their roof today." Samuel's hands, calloused and strong despite his appearance, gripped his worn toolbox tighter. He'd learned long ago that responding to their mockery only fed it. Instead, he kept walking toward the widow Henderson's grand estate on the hill, where a loose shingle had been rattling in the wind for days. The contrast between Samuel's world and Victoria Henderson's couldn't have been starker. Her three-story Victorian mansion stood like a monument to wealth and grief, its pristine white walls and black-trimmed windows reflecting both prosperity and mourning. Servants in pressed uniforms tended to manicured gardens, while Samuel approached the tradesman's entrance, hat in hand. "Mrs. Henderson is expecting you," said Martha, the head housekeeper, her tone neither warm nor cold, simply practical. "The loose shingle is on the east side. Try not to track mud on the walkway." As Samuel set up his ladder, he caught a glimpse of Victoria through a second-floor window. She stood motionless, her black dress making her appear like a beautiful statue carved from midnight. Even from this distance, he could see the weight of sorrow that had settled on her shoulders like a permanent shawl. Victoria Elizabeth Henderson had been the toast of Millfield society before tragedy struck. At 28, she had married Jonathan Henderson, heir to the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. Their love had been the stuff of fairy tales until consumption took him just 2 years later, leaving her alone with vast wealth and an even vaster emptiness. Now, 6 months after Jonathan's death, the pressure from society to remarry had become unbearable. "A woman of your standing cannot remain alone," her late husband's business partner, Cornelius Whitmore, had insisted just last week. "It's simply not proper, nor is it practical." Whitmore, a silver-haired banker with calculating eyes and an expanding waistline, had made his intentions clear. He wanted not just Victoria's hand, but control of the Henderson fortune. The marriage had been arranged by their families, a business transaction disguised as romance. From her window, Victoria watched Samuel work. His movements were precise, careful, each action deliberate, despite the ridicule he faced daily. She had seen how the townspeople treated him, how they turned away when he approached, how they spoke of him as if he were less than human. But Victoria saw something else. She saw the way he gently helped Mrs. Patterson's cat down from a tree last month, asking for no payment. She had witnessed him give his last piece of bread to a hungry child, then work all day without eating. In a world that judged worth by the weight of one's purse, Samuel carried wealth of a different kind. "Mom," Martha's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Whitmore has arrived for tea." Victoria sighed, her breath fogging the cool glass. "Tell him I'll be down presently." As she turned from the window, she didn't see Samuel pause in his work, looking up at the now empty frame where she had stood. But if she had seen the expression on his weathered face, she might have recognized something there. Not the desperate hunger of a man seeking wealth, but the quiet reverence of someone who had glimpsed something precious and believed it forever beyond his reach. In the parlor below, Cornelius Whitmore adjusted his gold pocket watch and practiced the smile he would use to seal both their fates. The autumn wind carried the scent of burning leaves and dying dreams through Millfield streets. Samuel sat on an overturned crate outside Murphy's General Store, mending a torn piece of canvas with the same patient precision he brought to everything he touched. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rust, but the beauty was lost on him as he listened to the conversation drifting from inside the store. "Mark my words," declared Henry Murphy, the store owner. "Whitmore's got that widow wrapped around his finger. Wedding set for next month." Heard it straight from his own mouth. "About time," added Mrs. Cornelia Price, the town's most prolific gossip. "Woman's been in mourning long enough. Besides, Whitmore's got the means to keep her in the style she's accustomed to." Samuel's needle paused mid-stitch. He had no right to feel the hollow ache that spread through his chest. But rights had never governed the human heart. "Course, can't say I blame her," Murphy continued. "What other choice does a woman like that have? Can't exactly marry beneath her station. Imagine if she took up with someone like that Rags fellow." The laughter that followed felt like stones thrown at Samuel's back. He gathered his mending and tools, rising to leave just as Victoria's carriage rounded the corner. The elegant black coach, pulled by two matching chestnuts, drew every eye on the street. But Victoria, despite her composed exterior, felt the weight of their stares like chains. She had come to town on a simple errand, to purchase fabric for what everyone assumed would be her wedding dress, but each step felt like walking toward her own execution. "Mrs. Henderson," Murphy greeted her with the effusive deference reserved for the wealthy. "What an honor. I trust you're well?" "Quite well, thank you," Victoria replied, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "I need 3 yards of your finest ivory silk." As Murphy bustled about gathering the fabric, Victoria became aware of a commotion outside. Through the window, she saw a group of young men, sons of the town's elite, surrounding a familiar figure. "Hey there, Rags," called out Benjamin Whitmore, the banker's eldest son. "Heard you've been doing work up at the Henderson place. Better watch yourself. Wouldn't want you tracking mud through the ladies' parlor." Samuel stood perfectly still as the circle tightened around him. His toolbox remained steady in his grip, though his knuckles had gone white. "Maybe we should help him clean up," suggested another youth, producing a bucket of dirty washwater from the back of the store. "Can't have the town eyesore offending delicate sensibilities." What happened next would be talked about in Millfield for years to come. The bucket was already tilting when Victoria's voice cut through the autumn air like a blade. "Benjamin Whitmore." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the authority of old money and older grief. "Put that bucket down, now." Every head turned. Victoria Henderson stood in the doorway of Murphy's store, her black dress making her appear both fragile and formidable. The ivory silk lay forgotten on the store counter behind her. "Mrs. Henderson," Benjamin stammered, the bucket wavering in his hands. That is to say, you were just demonstrating the difference between breeding and behavior," Victoria said, stepping down into the street. "A distinction that seems lost on you." The young men shifted uncomfortably. Benjamin, red-faced, set the bucket down hard, splashing water onto his own boots. "Now," Victoria continued, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "Mr. Hayes has completed excellent work on my property. I trust he will continue to receive the respect due to any honest working man in this community." Samuel stared at her, struck not just by her defense of him, but by the fact that she had called him by his name. His real name. In a town where he had become nothing more than Rags, someone had remembered that he was Samuel Hayes. "Furthermore," Victoria added, "Mr. Hayes, I believe we discussed additional repairs to my stable roof. Would Thursday morning be convenient?" It was a lie, and everyone knew it, but it was a lie that restored dignity to a man who had been stripped of it, a lie that turned charity into honest work. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel managed, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Thursday morning would be fine." Victoria nodded once, then turned back toward the store, leaving the group of young men to disperse like leaves before the wind. Inside Murphy's store, the merchant hurried to complete her purchase, chattering nervously about the weather and the upcoming harvest dance, but Victoria barely heard him. Her mind was replaying the moment she had seen Samuel surrounded, remembering the quiet dignity with which he had faced humiliation. That evening, as she sat in her empty mansion with the ivory silk spread across her bed, Victoria found herself thinking not about wedding dresses, but about the expression in Samuel's eyes when she had spoken his name. It had been the look of a man remembering he was human. 3 miles away, in the small room he rented above the livery stable, Samuel sat on his narrow bed, turning the day's events over in his mind. The wealthy widow of Millfield had not only defended him, she had seen him. In a world where he had become invisible, Victoria Henderson had looked at him and seen not rags and poverty, but Samuel Hayes. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to wonder what that might mean. Outside both their windows, the same stars shone down on a town that was about to discover that the heart recognizes no boundaries of class or circumstance. The morning of October 15, 1887, dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of golden sunlight that made even the dustiest corners of Millfield seem to glimmer with possibility. But for Victoria Henderson, standing before her bedroom mirror in the ivory silk dress that had cost more than most families earned in a year, the light felt cold and unforgiving. "You look beautiful, ma'am," Martha said softly, adjusting the long train of the dress. "Mr. Jonathan would be proud." Victoria's reflection stared back at her, a woman dressed for a wedding but feeling like she was attending a funeral. In 3 hours, she would walk down the aisle of St. Mary's Church and pledge her life to Cornelius Whitmore. In 3 hours, she would become a wife again, but to a man who saw her as an acquisition rather than a person. "Martha," Victoria said quietly, "do you believe in second chances?" The housekeeper paused in her ministrations. "Ma'am, do you think it's possible to find something real after you've lost everything that mattered?" Martha's weathered hands stilled on the dress fabric. "I think, ma'am, that sometimes what we think we've lost forever finds a way back to us, just not always in the form we expect." Across town, Samuel Hayes was finishing the last of his morning repairs to old Mrs. Patterson's fence. His hands worked automatically, his mind churning with thoughts he had no right to think. Today, Victoria Henderson would marry Cornelius Whitmore. Today, the one person in Millfield who had seen him as human would become forever beyond his reach. He had no intention of attending the wedding. What place did a man like him have in such a gathering? But as the church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to witness the union of the town's two most prominent citizens, Samuel found his feet carrying him toward the sound. St. Mary's Church had never seen such finery. The pews were packed with Millfield's elite, their silk dresses and tailored suits creating a sea of wealth and privilege. At the altar, Cornelius Whitmore waited, his chest puffed with the satisfaction of a man about to close the most important business deal of his life. Samuel slipped into the very back pew, behind the servants and working folk who had been allowed to witness the spectacle. His work clothes, though clean, marked him as clearly as if he wore a sign. He told himself he would leave after she walked down the aisle, after he saw her one last time as a woman who had shown him kindness. The organist began the wedding march, and every head turned toward the back of the church. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her arm linked with Judge Morrison's, who would give her away in the absence of family. She moved like a woman walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Her face was beautiful but empty, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the altar. Step by step, she moved down the aisle. Step by step, she drew closer to a future that felt like a prison with golden bars. Halfway down the aisle, her gaze swept the congregation, the faces of people who had known her all her life, who had watched her love and lose, and now expected her to love again on command. And then, in the very back pew, her eyes found Samuel. He was looking at her with an expression that took her breath away. Not with the calculated appraisal of the other men in the church, not with the possessive hunger of Whitmore, but with something she had thought lost forever. Pure, honest love. In that moment, Victoria Henderson remembered who she had been before grief and societal pressure had worn her down to this hollow version of herself. She remembered the woman who had once believed in following her heart, who had married Jonathan Henderson, not for his money, but for the way he made her feel alive. She stopped walking. Judge Morrison, confused, tugged gently at her arm. "My dear," he whispered. The congregation held its breath. At the altar, Cornelius Whitmore's face was beginning to redden with embarrassment and growing anger. "Victoria?" Pastor Williams called out, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "Are you all right?" Victoria's eyes never left Samuel's face. In that weathered, honest face, she saw everything that Whitmore was not. Kindness without calculation, strength without arrogance, love without condition. "Pastor Williams," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the church, "I'm afraid I cannot go through with this wedding." A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Cornelius stepped forward, his face now purple with rage. "Victoria, what are you talking about? You're obviously overcome with emotion. Judge Morrison, bring her forward." But Victoria had already stepped away from the judge. She was walking backward down the aisle, her eyes still locked on Samuel's. "I cannot marry a man I do not love," she announced, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I will not trade my heart for security, my soul for propriety." The church erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Ladies fanned themselves frantically, while men shook their heads in disbelief. But Victoria heard none of it. She had reached the back pew where Samuel sat frozen in amazement. "Samuel Hayes," she said, extending her hand to him, "would you walk out of here with me?" Samuel stared at her outstretched hand as if it were a mirage. Around them, the congregation was in chaos. Someone was shouting, probably Whitmore, and women were crying out in shock. "Ma'am," Samuel said quietly, "if I take your hand, there's no going back. They'll never forgive you. You'll lose everything." Victoria smiled then, the first genuine smile that had crossed her face in months. "Samuel, I lost everything when Jonathan died. What I'm asking for now is the chance to find something new, something real." Behind them, Cornelius Whitmore was pushing through the crowd, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "Victoria, I demand you explain this madness. You cannot throw away everything for him." Victoria finally turned to face her would-be husband. "Cornelius, I'm sorry for the embarrassment, but I cannot marry you. My heart belongs elsewhere." "To him?" Whitmore spat, pointing at Samuel. "To that vagrant, that nobody, to the man who showed me what true character looks like," Victoria replied evenly. "To someone who has never asked me for anything, but who has given me everything I needed, respect, kindness, and the reminder that I am more than my circumstances." Samuel stood then, his hand finally reaching for hers. The moment their fingers touched, a hush fell over the church. Here was the wealthy widow of Millfield in her $1,000 wedding dress, holding hands with a man whose clothes weren't worth $10. And in that silence, something shifted in the very air of the church. Some of the shock was giving way to something else. Recognition, perhaps, of a love that transcended the artificial boundaries society had constructed. "Come," Victoria whispered to Samuel, "let's go home." Together they walked out of St. Mary's Church, leaving behind a congregation that would talk about this day for generations to come. As they stepped into the golden October sunlight, Victoria felt as if she were breathing freely for the first time since Jonathan's death. Behind them, in the chaos of the abandoned wedding, Cornelius Whitmore stood at the altar, his carefully laid plans in ruins, while the town of Millfield learned that sometimes the heart has its own agenda, one that cannot be bought, sold, or arranged. 3 months had passed since the wedding that never was, and Millfield was still adjusting to the scandal that had rocked its foundations. Victoria Henderson, now Victoria Hayes, stood in the kitchen of a modest 2-story house on the outskirts of town, her hands dusted with flour as she learned to bake bread. The transformation in her life had been swift and decisive. Within a week of walking out of St. Mary's Church, she had liquidated most of her assets, keeping only enough to purchase a simple home and ensure their basic security. The grand mansion on the hill now belonged to strangers. But Victoria felt lighter than she had in years. "Samuel," she called toward the back porch, where her husband was repairing a neighbor's chair. "The bread is almost ready." Samuel Hayes looked up from his work, still marveling at the simple miracle of hearing his wife call his name. Wife. Even after 3 months, the word felt like a dream he might wake from at any moment. Their courtship had been brief but intense. After the church incident, Victoria had insisted they do things properly, with calling hours, chaperoned visits, and a small ceremony performed by Pastor Williams once the town's shock had settled into grudging acceptance. Some had predicted the marriage would last mere weeks, a folly of misguided romance. Instead, it had grown stronger each day. "Mrs. Hayes," called a voice from the front gate. Samuel and Victoria exchanged glances. They rarely received visitors, as most of Millfield's society still treated them as pariahs. Victoria opened the door to find young Timothy Morrison, Judge Morrison's grandson, hat in hand and looking nervous. "Mom," Timothy said, "my grandfather sent me. There's been an accident at the Henderson mine." Samuel appeared behind Victoria, his tool belt still around his waist. "What kind of accident, son?" "Cave-in, sir. Trapped 7 men inside. They're asking for anyone with mining experience to help with the rescue." Samuel nodded grimly. He had worked in mines before coming to Millfield, knowledge that might prove valuable now. "I'll get my equipment." "Samuel," Victoria said, catching his arm. "Be careful." He covered her hand with his. "Always am, Mrs. Hayes." The scene at the Henderson mine was chaos. Cornelius Whitmore, who had assumed control of Victoria's former mining interests, stood arguing with the rescue foreman while precious time ticked away. "I'm telling you," Whitmore insisted, "we need to bring in professional crews from Denver. These local men don't have the expertise." "Mr. Whitmore," interrupted the foreman, a weathered man named Jack Sullivan, "those men have maybe 6 hours of air left. Denver's a day away." Samuel arrived with his equipment, and Sullivan's face brightened with recognition. "Hayes, thank God! You worked the silver mines in Colorado, didn't you?" 3 years, Samuel confirmed, already studying the rescue plans. "What's the situation?" As Sullivan explained the cave-in, Samuel noticed Whitmore's face darkening with recognition and anger. The banker stepped forward, his voice cold. "I will not have that man anywhere near my operation," Whitmore declared. "He has no business here." The crew fell silent. Everyone knew the history between the 2 men, but with lives hanging in the balance, the personal drama seemed petty and dangerous. "Cornelius," Samuel said quietly, "this isn't about us. There are 7 men down there with families. Don't presume to lecture me about responsibility," Whitmore snarled. "You, who destroyed a perfectly good woman's reputation for your own selfish desires." "That's enough." The voice that cut through the argument belonged to Victoria, who had arrived with medical supplies and Dr. Matthews. "Cornelius, I made my own choice. These men don't have the luxury of choice. They need help now." She moved to stand beside Samuel, her presence lending him an authority that his ragged past could not. "My husband knows these mines better than anyone here. If you care more about your pride than those men's lives, then you're not the man I thought you were." The tension stretched taut for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then Jack Sullivan spoke up. "Mr. Whitmore, with respect, Samuel Hayes knows mining. Those men are running out of time." Whitmore's jaw worked silently before he stepped aside with obvious reluctance. "Fine, but any mishap is on your head, Hayes." The rescue operation that followed became the stuff of legend in Millfield. Samuel descended into the unstable mineshaft with a small crew, his knowledge of cave-in patterns and structural engineering proving invaluable. While others had wanted to blast through the debris, Samuel identified a safer route that would take longer, but preserve the pocket of air, keeping the trapped miners alive. Hour by hour, the rescue team worked. Victoria remained above ground, tending to the families of the trapped men and organizing supplies. Her presence, a wealthy woman working alongside common folk, gradually began to shift how the town saw her transformation. "Never thought I'd see the day," murmured Mrs. Patterson to her neighbor, when Victoria Henderson would be ladling soup for miners' families. "Victoria Hayes," corrected Martha, Victoria's former housekeeper, who had volunteered to help with the rescue effort. "And I've never seen her look happier." As the sun set, Samuel's voice finally echoed up from the mine shaft. "We've got them! All 7, alive!" The cheer that went up from the crowd could be heard throughout Millfield. One by one, the rescued miners were brought to the surface, dirty and shaken but breathing. The last man out clasped Samuel's hand with tears in his eyes. "You saved our lives, Hayes. Don't know how to thank you." Samuel, exhausted and covered in mine dust, simply nodded, just doing what needed doing. Cornelius Whitmore approached as the crowd began to disperse. His face was a complicated mixture of emotions, residual anger, grudging respect, and something that might have been shame. "Hayes," he said quietly, that was good work down there." Samuel met his eyes steadily. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." "About what I said earlier," Whitmore began, then stopped. "Well, perhaps I was hasty. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement." In the weeks that followed, the story of the mine rescue spread throughout the territory. Samuel Hayes, the man they had once called Rags, became known as the hero who had risked his life to save 7 men. More importantly, the rescue had demonstrated what Victoria had seen in him all along, that true worth had nothing to do with the cut of a man's clothes or the size of his bank account. The change in how Millfield treated the Hayes family was gradual but unmistakable. Samuel began receiving more work, not the grudging charity jobs of before, but genuine requests from people who had learned to respect his skills. Victoria found herself welcomed back into circles that had once shunned her, though she was selective about which invitations she accepted. On a spring evening, 6 months after the rescue, Samuel and Victoria sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Victoria's head rested on Samuel's shoulder, her hand covering his where it lay on the porch railing. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked quietly. "Giving up everything you had?" Victoria smiled, thinking of the mansion she had once called home, now feeling as distant as another lifetime. "I didn't give up everything, Samuel. I traded a beautiful prison for a simple freedom. I traded loneliness for love. Even when the whole town was ready to shun you. Especially then," Victoria replied, "because that's when I learned who my real friends were. That's when I learned what I was truly made of." Samuel lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Mrs. Hayes. And I love you, Mr. Hayes, rags and all." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. The same stars that had once shone down on 2 lonely people who thought they understood the boundaries of their world. Now they knew better. Love, real love, recognized no boundaries at all. In the town below, the story of Samuel and Victoria Hayes was already becoming legend, the tale of a woman who chose love over convention and a man who proved that character mattered more than circumstance. It was a story that would be told for generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of choosing to see the worth in another human soul. And in Millfield, where social hierarchies had once seemed carved in stone, that story had changed everything. The man they had once mocked for his rags had shown them what true wealth looked like, and it had nothing to do with gold.